Today I've got a PS5 CFI-1015B. This is the digital North American first generation, and we have no video output on this thing. So first thing we need to do is take this bottom cover off. So I've got this thing upside down at the moment. Usually if you pull slightly upwards on this corner and slide in this direction, you can usually get this to open up. Sometimes they're a little stubborn. This one came off pretty easily. If you have any trouble with it, just take your time and be patient and persistent. So we'll set this aside. We've got a vent right here in the corner, and if you lift up in the center here, that's just going to pop right out like that. And we're going to have 4 screws here for our fan and 1 PS5 Phillips screw. This one's pretty easy to remove. And that is going to allow you to take off the cover for the expansion memory slot here, if you get it all the way out. Okay, and that's just going to slide over like so. You do not need to remove that screw. And we also have this little piece right here, and we're going to peel this off. This one comes off pretty clean most of the time, regardless, as long as you get underneath it with something. And adding a little heat does not hurt. But I just want to show you this one can actually peel off pretty easily. I'm just going to set this here for now so we remember to put it back on. Warranty sticker right here, you do not need. This does not void your warranty if it is removed. Just a quick note, but I'm going to try to take it off without making a big mess. But again, remember, this sticker not being there does not mean that your warranty is voided. If you really take your time, you can get this off in one piece, but like I said, we're not worried about that. So we're just going to peel this back so we can expose the screw underneath. And then we're going to remove a whole bunch of screws here. These 4 go first or last, doesn't matter. But you do want to organize them and keep track of whether or not they're threaded and what length they are, whether or not they're fine thread, machine thread or not. There's a whole bunch of different types of screws here, so make sure you lay them out in order. Many of them are not interchangeable. All right, after you got your screws out, you can lift off this panel here, and then we want to very carefully unplug this fan connector. So I try to grip this as far down at the bottom as you can. It does have a certain amount of strength, but if you just yank on these wires, you can actually pull them right out. And you can actually damage this on the board. So just very gently grip it at the bottom, very carefully wiggle it, lift it up, and there is our fan. Now we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more screws to remove from this model. And I usually like to magnetize for this one because it gets stuck in there. Alright, once you got all those screws out, you can lift up on this plastic. Just like that. Very clean machine we have here today. And one little note, do keep track of this little piece right here. This is a dust cover for your memory expansion slot, and these like to fall out, so do keep an eye on that. I'm going to put a small amount of rubbing alcohol under this paper, which holds the antenna wire in place. Antenna wires. I don't know why they went with just a cheap post-it note looking thing here, but we'll try to preserve that. And if not, you can always tape these down with something else when you put them back together. You want to be very careful disconnecting the antennas. Be sure that you're only prying under the metal piece and not under the wire itself. And these are just going to come straight up like so. So we've got 4 on this model. We're going to pull this flex cable straight out, just like that. Same with this one down here. And we'll let this sit for a second, but eventually we should be able to just kind of get right underneath this adhesive if our rubbing alcohol did its job. And that way we can go back and use these stickers again when we put this thing together. That out of the way. Now we have a whole bunch of silver screws that need to come out. Make sure you get every single one of these, because if not, you're going to bend this panel as you try to lift it out, because there is going to be some resistance underneath this. Alright, so if you've got all the screws out, and notice there's also one here through the motherboard and up here where these little triangles are. Now we should be able to lift up, and like I said, you will feel a bit of resistance here, but it shouldn't be too difficult, and you'll hear a pop here in just a second. And that is just the thermal substance, thermal material separating from the these coils here. Alright, so now we have this connector here. What you're going to do is actually push down on this metal tab on the inside, and then you can just kind of slide this outwards. So let's go this way, like so, and that way you'll preserve those tabs on the edges that lock it into place. And then we've got 2 Phillips screws here on this heatsink clamp. And one thing I'd like to do, just so I don't forget, is before I remove this, take this little piece off the back of the HDMI port right here. And that's got some adhesive holding it down. I'm just going to set this here so I do remember to put that back on. Go ahead and take this off the rest of the way. Okay, we'll set that aside. And we're going to do 2 things here. We're going to protect the liquid metal that's on the heatsink and that's on the motherboard so that we don't disturb it, because having to replace that is just one extra step that we really don't need to take. So we're going to hold on to this little piece here. It comes in kind of handy. We'll get some tape and something like this to cover up the heatsink itself. And if you lift from this side, you'll find that you might need to do some prying right along the edge over here. Sometimes it comes up easily, but if it doesn't, you're going to pry like right over here. So let me grab a spudger. Okay, so while you're lifting this, you don't want to go in too far, obviously. There are components on the other side of the motherboard, but you can hit this corner right here where that screw hole was. Just kind of work your way across, and the main thing we're disconnecting here is from the power supply, these pins that come through the board, as you'll see when we flip it over. And what we're going to do is immediately cover this, and we're going to use this to cover the processor like so. And I'm going to tape that down. Let me get this out of the way first. So just make sure you don't disturb any of this. We'll just move the whole thing over all at once, out of the way. And now what we're going to do is grab some, let's get refocused here. Actually, we can get a little closer. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get some painter's tape. I'm just going to put a strip across here. This is going to keep this thing from shifting. I'd recommend you tape across the metal panel because sometimes they like to pop out of the plastic. So you want to make sure this whole thing stays in place. And now, even if we turn it upside down, we don't have to worry about the liquid metal going anywhere. And one more precaution you may consider. This is not 100% required, but it takes about 10 seconds, and it will potentially save you some headaches if you aren't very experienced with this repair. So what we're going to do is cover up a diode and a capacitor that are right here on the back side of the HDMI port. I'll show you that later on, or actually you'll be able to see it while we're cleaning this area up later. But I'm just going to take a strip of copper tape about this wide. That's actually probably wider than we need it to be, but that's okay. We're just going to lay it right here so that it covers those 2 components. And if there's a little too much airflow, we don't have to worry about them blowing off the board. That shouldn't be an issue, but like I said, if you haven't done these before, a lot of people have a tough time getting tuned into the right amount of heat that these things take in order to remove. All right, we're going to switch over to the microscope, get our hot air, and we're going to heat this from the underside. Where are we? Okay, so we're going to heat this from the underside until we see the solder liquefy, and then we're going to gently lift it off. If you use any amount of force to remove this too soon, you can easily tear the traces that are behind here, and then you just create a whole lot of extra work for yourself. All right, here's our port. Now I'm going to be at this distance while I'm working so that you can see everything on camera, but I wonder if I can show you. It looks like most of these pins are still connected, so we probably got one here on the end. Let's zoom in here. So if you look right here, This is probably the main source of our problem. This little pin right here is not connected. That one isn't either, so these first two pins are definitely 3, 4. Yeah, so these 4 pins are all disconnected. And the rest of them look like they're still on there. Now what you want to do, you do want to pay attention to this capacitor right here. Make sure you don't knock that off the board. Sometimes they are missing because the port gets pushed in too far, and you need that most of the time. It's kind of an iffy thing. Sometimes you'll get 4K without that, and sometimes you won't, and sometimes there's an issue where you've got to restart the system all the time. So long story short, I'd recommend you try to preserve that. It's not there for no reason all the time. So the main thing you'll be fighting on this, as you probably already know, is keeping this board warm enough to work with, because it cools down very fast, requires a lot of heat, and for that reason, among others, we're using leaded solder, and you can put some down here beforehand if you want, but I'm actually kind of experimenting with the new way I've been doing this. I used to always put solder on there, set this in, and then bond the pins first. But I think it's more stable if we just connect these anchors, and getting the solder to flow through is a little tricky on this anyways. So you could start soldering on this side just to hold this in place, just to get a little solder on the upper part here, because like I said, it is a little tricky to get it to flow through. And I wonder if we just start here, that would give us a little more stability when we're working on the center. But you can do it either way. Like I said, lots of ways to get this done effectively. Yeah, I suppose that's one way of doing it. Anyways, I'm going to go back to over here and getting these pins connected. Make sure that's nice and flush with the board. And we'll go across this with some solder on the top, because what you'll see is some of these look, I guess the board's still pretty warm, so we're in good shape. That's the main thing. These ground pins are going to be slightly more difficult. Well, that was easy enough. Alright, so we're going to come back to this part. Actually, let's see. Can I do it without burning the plastic here? Yeah, we're going to come back to this part after I've got the anchor secured. So we'll flip this over. Alright, so we're going to take this piece off. We don't need this anymore. And those are the two components I was talking about. Diode here, capacitor there. Okay, so the lines on the diode, hopefully, I guess you can't see. Let's zoom in here. So the lines on the diode are facing the circuit and not ground, just in case you needed that info. Alright, so now we're going to preheat the board again, add some flux, and then get this anchor secured. I want that to flow down to the other side. So, generous amount. And probably should have grabbed my bigger iron. Yeah, board's cooling down a little bit here, so we'll add a bit more heat. Get this thing to flow to the other side. And you'll usually see when the solder kind of sinks in. It's a bit much. Alright, you see that? That typically means we've got good penetration on those. Over here. Now I've got to make sure we got enough solder in there. Flip it over again. And you can see that, yeah, so everything's coming through on this side. Could add a tiny bit up here, but for the most part this should be fine. Let's see. Yeah, so sometimes I like to come with the iron on this side just to make it get all the way around that footing. So we need a tiny bit more heat here. Alright, that ought to do the trick. Now, the last little fun part here is we've got to get inside here and not disturb that capacitor. So, yeah, this is always fun. And I say that because not everyone is going to have a very small iron that will fit in here and conduct enough heat to melt this thing. So again, you may have to work on just getting the board preheated to the right temperature. Make sure you've got sufficient flux and solder. And with me, I generally end up cleaning out this HDMI port, so I don't worry too much about getting a little solder, or excuse me, a little flux on the inside, because we're going to give it a good wipe down when we finish, just to make sure there are no problems in the future. And the board's probably cooling off a bit now, so see how shaky my hands are. There we go. I think that is going to work, so if you have any doubts, just go along and make sure that none of these move afterwards. And if you have a multimeter, not a bad idea to check for continuity between two adjacent pins, just to make sure nothing got bridged. Typically you can tell by looking down inside here though. So we'll give this a good cleaning, and we should be ready to reassemble. Alright, we'll clean up the back and we'll be ready to put this thing back together. Looks like our flux got a little thick here, so we might have to chip some of this off. It's not critical, but you know, I like to see a nice clean board. Some of this stuff just got a little thick. Obviously, be careful not to scratch the board when you do that, if you have to do that. Alright, that way you can see what you're doing. And no, that is not a bridge. That is just a little flux trapped on the inside. I'd say we're good. And we are going to do a partial reassembly just so that we can test and make sure everything's working before we put all of the screws back in. Alright, so one thing I'm going to do here is take a look inside of the HDMI port, and you probably can't see on camera, but occasionally, let's see if we can zoom down in here. Occasionally you'll get a bit of flux on the inside. I don't know if you can see that or not, but in either case, we're just going to take a small pair of tweezers and a lint-free Kimtech wipe with a bit of alcohol on it, and we're going to carefully, and I cannot stress that enough, just carefully get this down on either side, because obviously we don't want to damage the pins, so don't put a lot of pressure in here. But if you just kind of gently use the tissue and not really your tweezers, to brush off the inside. That'll usually get rid of any excess flux that might have leaked through, because it doesn't take much to interrupt the signal. So that should be good. We'll let that dry out for a second, and then let me set up a camera. Alright, so let's hit the power button and see what happens. Alright, so we've got our logo. Wiggle this around just very gently and everything looks good. I will test the Wi-Fi next. We want to do that before we put everything back together, make sure that's working, and of course the controller.